approximately 0321 Zulu. Reminder that Dragon will nominally continue its approach through waypoint 1 towards waypoint 2 without stopping.
Dragon copies, go for approach 0.
And there we just heard some conversations between that core crew operations resource engineer here at SpaceX Mission Control in Hawthorne and NASA astronaut and Crew 10 Commander Ann McClain. They were talking about approaching waypoint 0. They had that go, no-go poll. Again, those are joint polls between the SpaceX team in Hawthorne as well as NASA's team in Houston, just to verify that all systems on Dragon, all systems on the space station look good and can proceed past that waypoint 0 that we were just
That's true. And SpaceX on our the 23rd to, one thing I really like about it is its name was Droog, which was the Russian name for friend. And as Commander Anne McClain said, it is a nod to the unique and deep cultural traditions from which each of us come. So noting the very international nature of this crew.
And so some of the previous indicators, so Crew-9, who is obviously currently on board the International Space Station, their indicator was actually a plush baby falcon named Aurora. So it previously flew on 2 Russian Soyuz capsules, including the flight that resulted in an emergency abort that NASA astronaut Nichole was actually a part of. And so Nichole is now going to be monitoring today's approach, and he will also return home after that handover period with Crew-9 back to Earth.
And you know, as we're talking about zero-G indicators, I gotta say my favorite is the little plushy Earth that went up on the Demo 1 mission. You know, we talked a little bit earlier, Anne McClain was on the space station when Dragon arrived for its uncrewed Demo 1 test flight, that paved the way for all of these crew rotation flights for NASA and for Axiom Space as well. And that little plushy Earth, oh man, I smiled a lot looking at Anne's smile when she saw that sitting inside the Dragon capsule. And then you can see Anne there on the right-hand box. Anne is on the left-hand side working on that tablet right now. Now a view of the International Space Station. So this is cool. You've got the ISS looking down at Dragon on your left, and you've got Dragon looking up at the ISS on your right. I mean, the views don't get much better than that, except for maybe the 4 people who are in Dragon.
And so the International Space Station and Dragon are currently flying just off the coast of Australia, again, as they make that, or as Dragon makes its final approach to the International Space Station. So Dragon is currently about 560 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to close in. Again, we recently did have that go past that waypoint 0. So next up will be that waypoint 1 that we expect in just a few minutes.
Yeah, and from that initial test flight that Dragon did in March of 2019, that was then followed in May of 2020. Kind of hard to believe we're also approaching the 5-year anniversary of Dragon human spaceflight missions as well this year. We had that Demo 2 mission with Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley in May, launching in May of 2020 and coming back a couple of months later in August. And then we started those crew rotation missions for the commercial crew program for NASA in November of that year with our Crew-1 crew and Dragon. And since that point, there's always been a Dragon at the International Space Station.
And so we did mention earlier there are currently 4 Dragons that are active. So they're flying today on the Dragon spacecraft Endurance. And typically whenever there is a new Dragon, the crew gets to name it. And so we have Endurance, Resilience, Endeavor, Freedom.
And Freedom, yes.
And also, so we talked a little bit about the zero gravity indicator. The crew also works to design their mission patch ahead of each mission. And so that also dates back and has quite a history with those mission patches. So the SpaceX Crew-10 patch was designed by the 4-person crew. They actually used AI for some initial inspiration, and then a human artist perfected the design. So it's a patch with the Roman numeral X boldly in the center, representing the 10th operational flight of the Dragon spacecraft. And then on the patch, the Dragon. And it's a nod to the 4 crew members who are all professional pilots. So we mentioned that a little bit earlier when we were going through the bios of NASA astronauts Anne McClain, Nichole, Ayers, JAXA astronaut Takuya, Onishi, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill, Peskov. All of them have a pilot or aviation history, so that was a little bit of a nod in their patch as well. And again, you're seeing some live views there of NASA astronaut Anne McClain and NASA astronaut Nichole Ayers to the left and right. They're
is in alignment, but if everything is already in alignment, there's really no reason to stop and we can proceed forward.
And so once they do proceed forward, they'll then get to waypoint 1, and waypoint 1, so you go from 400 meters at waypoint 0, and then waypoint 1 is about 220 meters, and that's when we get to that docking access arrival. And so they'll have that go ahead and proceed to that point. And once they are on that docking access, it basically means they are directly in front of the port, so that forward port on node 2 of the Harmony module that they will be docking to today. So Dragon will be looking directly at that International Space Station docking port, and they can do some final alignment checks if they need to. And then from there, they will then move to waypoint 2, which is just 20 meters away. And there you can see another view of Dragon. This is a camera on the International Space Station, and they're currently flying over Sydney, Australia. So that's the International Space Station looking out at Dragon. Those cameras are actually controlled by one of the flight controllers in Mission Control in Houston. So the Cronus typically operates those cameras, and they're the ones that are manually moving those cameras up and down and trying to find Dragon and keep a focus on it so that we can have these amazing views here today.
And as Dragon, as you mentioned, that waypoint 1 point about 220 meters from the International Space Station, that's very close to, but just outside what's known as the keep out sphere for the International Space Station. This is the sphere that any visiting vehicle needs to stay outside of until given explicit permission to proceed in closer to the International Space Station. We would expect that go no go poll to either come when they're holding at waypoint 1, or if they don't need to hold at waypoint 1, shortly before they're to then proceed into waypoint 2, 20 meters from the station. Again, another point where they could hold if they need to, and we have on past flights seen them hold sometimes at that waypoint 2 20-meter point for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's alignment, sometimes it's been visuals and lighting conditions, with just where the International Space Station is in its orbit. Might seem kind of odd to think that, wait, why would we need to wait if we can dock at night? But shadows are really important in understanding them and how they interplay with the autonomous navigation systems.
And so we're actually pretty close to that waypoint 0 mark. We're about 403 meters. So Dragon's about 403 meters away from the International Space Station. So just around that waypoint 0 mark that we've been talking about. Now Dragon will continue past that point and into waypoint 1, which is again that 220 meter mark. So it really is just a choreography that it follows throughout its final approach and docking today.
And if you think about the overall trajectory of a
that 4 kilometer by 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer boundary. Basically, it's the neighborhood of the International Space Station. So once a visiting vehicle such as Dragon makes it into that approach ellipsoid, that's when a lot of those joint and integrated operations begin. And again, to enter into the AE, Dragon or any visiting vehicle has to be what is known, it has to be on what we call a 24-hour safe free drift trajectory, which means the spacecraft would not cross into the AE or the approach ellipsoid for at least 24 hours. So when they do those go, no-go polls to proceed in that is one of the things that they're looking for, making sure that that the vehicle is safe and can proceed in. And so now we're going inside that next invisible boundary around the space station, which is that keep out sphere that we've been mentioning.
And if you're just joining us here, some great views that are on your screen as Dragon is approaching the International Space Station just inside of 400 meters now, passing waypoint 0. On the left-hand side of your screen is a live view from the International Space Station looking down at Dragon. You can kind of see it moving across the white clouds there, about to go over the blue ocean in the middle of the screen there. And then on the right, we did have some images of the International Space Station and some images inside of Dragon as as well. But you know, Anna, it never gets old looking at views of spacecraft silhouetted against Earth.
And if we think these views are amazing, I just can't imagine what Crew-9 thinks of these views looking down at Earth from the Dragon spacecraft. So you did mention we were inside of waypoint 0.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Approach 0 has started and trajectory has converged on waypoint 1. Expect arrival at waypoint 1 at approximately 0347 Zulu.
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop, copy 0347 Zulu for waypoint 1.
And you hear that sequence of calls there confirming that Dragon successfully passed waypoint 0 and the trajectory has aligned where we want it to waypoint 1. So everything going very, very good there. And we're expecting the arrival there at waypoint 1 in just about 25 minutes from now.
So once we get to waypoint 1, Dragon will be about 220 meters away from the International Space Station. So again, this is another checkpoint on the way to the International Space Station. And then that final checkpoint is waypoint 2, which is just 20 meters away. And then from there, we will have that initial contact and capture, what is known as soft capture, before those 12 hooks, 2 sets of 6 deploy to have that hard capture. And then they can begin releasing those umbilicals for data and power, and then begin the pressurization activities for the vestibule, which is that area between the station hatch and the Dragon hatch that had been previously exposed to the vacuum of space. They'll conduct some leak checks, and then, of course, welcome the new crew aboard the International Space Station.
And yesterday when we lifted off, we were talking about the precise second that we had to lift off to be in the correct plane to reach the International Space Station today. And liftoff times are very, very choreographed, tightly choreographed to make sure we can do this. But once we get into orbit, it becomes a little bit different, right? And the timings of various burns, the timings of arrivals can all change. And that's basically because you've got Earth's gravity pulling on the spacecraft, you've got the moon, you've got some of the other planets, and the orbits, we do really good at predicting them, but once we see what the spacecraft is actually doing, it helps us refine those timelines a little bit like we saw today. And the timings of those burns changing a little bit, maybe not needing to do some of them if Dragon is doing really well. So it really is interesting how it shifts from super precise to now we've got to see what they're actually doing in space.
Typically, when we have a launch, we have what's known as a targeted docking window. So then, of course, it shifts a little based on those burns, whereas the launch itself is an instantaneous launch window, so it has to go at that exact minute and second. So again, yesterday's launch took place at 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific, and since then, Dragon has had about a 28-hour journey to make its way to the International Space Station. Dragon is now just about 330 meters away from the International Space Station. It's now inside waypoint 0, approaching waypoint 1, which is that 220-meter mark. And then from there, it'll continue on and enter inside what is known as the keep-out sphere, which is that 200-meter boundary around the International Space Station before we have that docking. So it's been a long journey for Crew-10 since launch yesterday, and even before that, because they had all of those preparations leading up to launch, getting suited up, those final medical checks, all of the various processes that they went through prior to that liftoff at 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific. So I'm sure they will be glad to be welcomed on board the International Space Station in really just a few minutes from now.
Yeah, and after that liftoff yesterday, and after the crew initially got onto orbit, there were some things that they needed to do as Dragon, configured itself for the orbital journey up to the International Space Station today. The crew got some time to eat, they got some time to rest and relax as well over the course of the last 28 hours. So it hasn't just been fully in their suits, in their seats. They were able to take those suits off shortly after liftoff. They are, of course, back in those suits now because during the more critical operations of spaceflight, such as launch, docking, undocking, and reentry and splashdown, we do have the crews in those intravehicular activity suits, or IVA suits as we call them.
So you'd mentioned a little bit some of the free time that they've had without those suits. They did have that sleep period. They woke up today around 8 a.m. Central, 8 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Central. So they've been up for about 10 hours or so getting ready for today's docking operations, but they did have that time to take a nap and get well rested and ready to be part of the Expedition 72 crew. And also on the International Space Station, not that long ago, the ISS crew was actually asleep right before we came on air. So they finished those post-sleep operations that they go through to start getting ready for today's docking operations. Again, NASA astronaut Nichole will be monitoring Dragon's approach.
And SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Expect reconfiguration of C2V2 return link to support docking video shortly.
SpaceX Dragon, copy.
And that call basically saying that that C2V2, the common communication for visiting vehicle system that allows Dragon to talk to the ISS to talk to the ground, it just sort of creates some nice redundant communication paths for all the vehicles and all the teams involved today. That system was primarily configured for the initial approach of Dragon up to the station through waypoint 0, and we just heard them briefing the crew that they'll be reconfiguring that again for the docking portion.
So we'll continue to hear a lot of those call-outs from the ground teams and the astronauts on the International Space Station, as well as Dragon, as we continue to get into the final stages of docking today. Right now, Dragon is about 310 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to fly in to make its final approach and docking. So it's getting pretty close now. And there you're continuing to see, if you squint, you can see a view of Dragon there in the center of your screen. So again, these are views captured by cameras on the International Space Station. And so that is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft, and it's actually the 4th flight for that Endurance spacecraft. It previously flew 3 other commercial crew program missions, Crew-3, Crew-5, and Crew-7, and the 4th flight, obviously, today for Crew-10.
That's right. And overall, this is the 10th crew rotation mission for NASA's Commercial Crew Program that Dragon is flying. It's also Dragon's 14th human spaceflight mission to the International Space Station and Dragon's 16th human spaceflight mission overall, since Dragons don't always go to the International Space Station, but we have had 2 free flyer missions in the Inspiration 4 and Polaris Dawn missions as well. And with the Crew-10 mission, Dragon has carried 60 crew members at this point across its 16 missions.
And so, yeah, Dragon has had 10 rotational missions, so that continues to be part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. We also have, of course, the Commercial Resupply Services, and we have the Commercial Earth Orbit Development Program working on potential future commercial space stations. So space is really becoming a commercial public-private endeavor, and you see that here as Dragon is docking to the International Space Station. The International Space Station, again, once Crew-10 is on board the International Space Station, they will partake in a multitude of science experiments, technology demonstrations, all for the benefit of humanity. And so as Dragon continues to make its final approach to the International Space Station, now about 370 meters away, let's go ahead and turn it back over to NASA's Gary Jordan at NASA's Mission Control Center in Houston.
Hey, thank you, Anna. We are following along on the action here, now inside the approach ellipse. We are in what is called joint operations. Both teams in each of the flight control rooms here in Houston, as well as where you are, Anna, at the Mission Control Center over in Hawthorne, California, with the SpaceX teams, are operating by the same joint flight rules. They're working through the procedures step by step, doing go, no-go polls along the way to make sure that all teams are ready for the next steps. The teams here in Mission Control Houston are currently polling to make sure that we can pass waypoint 1 and go inside waypoint 2. When we pass waypoint 1, we're going to be inside what is called the keep out sphere. Now, when we cross that boundary, there are a new set of flights that the crew can proceed all the way to docking, currently scheduled again for tonight at 11 p.m. Central Time, 9 p.m. Pacific. So the station is continuing to prepare for the crew's arrival. Like as I mentioned before, the station's solar arrays are feathered. We did configure the station itself to be in the docking attitude, and teams here are working through the C2V2 system, the common communication for visiting vehicles, power cycling that and make sure that data is flowing between the two spacecraft, the International Space Station and Crew-10 Endurance, and that the Crew-10, when it's on the docking axis right in front of the International Space Station going in towards the forward port, has a perfect view of the docking ring, of the docking port, the international docking adapter. And as it closes its way in, has all the data
Dragon
it needs.
is transmitting camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in the Dragon docking monitor.
This is Capcom Test Caswell here in Mission Control Houston, standing by for confirmation from the crew aboard Endurance. This was the troubleshooting issue I was addressing with the common communications for visiting vehicles, power cycling that system to make sure that they could have that video once they get on the station's docking axis. As we wait for crew confirmation, we are getting video from the International Space Station's external cameras.
And Houston Station, on the big loop, I can confirm I have good centerline camera. Station looks beautiful.
Houston copies.
Now it's critical that the teams communicate on this big loop to make sure all stakeholders are aware of the progress that's being made. That's cycling to enable Nick Hague, who's aboard the International Space Station. He's got a display in front of him monitoring the docking operations and receiving data from Dragon itself into the International Space Station. This is a safeguard. Dragon's rendezvous and docking to the International Space Station is a fully automated process. However, Hague does have an ability to execute commands if necessary, but really only there for monitoring. So that C2V2 power cycling allows him to have the view from Dragon itself as it moves up towards the docking axis, which you're seeing now on your screen from the external cameras aboard the International Space Station. Hague monitoring Dragon's arrival, receiving data including range and range rate, making sure that Dragon is moving at the expected velocity, speed, position. Everything's positioned on board the International Space Station for docking. Again, the station itself at the docking attitude. Now again, the station teams here in the International Space Station flight control room polling to make sure that Dragon itself can proceed past waypoint 1 towards waypoint 2. Waypoint 2 being just 20 meters in front of the International Space Station's docking port. This will be inside the keep-out sphere. It is Nick Hague monitoring the operations from the International Space Station. Now, once it makes its way in to dock with the space station, it'll be NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore that is tasked with the responsibility of opening up the hatches and preparing the station to welcome the crew aboard Endurance. This includes opening up several hatches, including the Node 2 hatch and the A-Pass hatch, both of which are closed for the docking operations and cannot be opened until the docking is complete. He'll start venting air to make sure that the air is circulating properly through the pressurized mating adapter. And there's no pockets of carbon dioxide, just a safety procedure. When he's going to inspect the hatch, he'll be wearing goggles and gloves for safety measures. We'll cover all of that post-docking, but that'll be Butch Wilmore's responsibility. We'll also begin as camera views from inside the station. These were set up by NASA astronaut Don Pettit. The crew waking up and making sure on an early day aboard the International Space Station, much earlier than their typical day. In fact, their crew wake period was just after midnight Greenwich Mean Time, which is the time that they operate aboard the International Space Station. They were up and making sure that everything was prepared for Crew 10's arrival today. Now we're making our way up the docking axis. Beautiful views as Endurance makes its way above the horizon of the Earth. Again, it's making its way towards the docking axis. This is immediately in front of the International Space Station. The camera views from Dragon itself illuminating the solar arrays. You can see the original solar arrays of the International Space Station, as well as the IROSAs, the rollout solar arrays that are augmenting some of the station's power. This as part of a process to continue the science done aboard the International Space Station, which is, of course, the mission of the astronauts and cosmonaut aboard Crew 10. Crew 10 really just a transport mission to get to the International Space Station. Once there, they join Expedition 72 for at least a time. Don Pettit, NASA astronaut Don Pettit, will be returning aboard a Soyuz. Once that Soyuz undocks, crew on board the International Space Station officially begins Expedition 73, continuing the great science and technology demonstration with orbit to prepare for future human missions to deep space, including the Moon and to Mars. Camera views from inside Dragon Endurance showing displays that show some of the trajectory that is necessary to converge with the docking. This is waypoint 1. Now when you see those displays, you'll see the trajectory curve out, the spacecraft itself calculating breakout maneuvers that are necessary as it makes its way along the planned set of procedures and approach maneuvers. Waypoint 1 immediately in front of the docking axis. Once that is executed, the Dragon will fire its Draco thrusters to maneuver inside. We're inside 6 minutes from the planned arrival of waypoint 1, continuing to get these fantastic views provided from the International Space Station, as well as from inside Dragon itself. Commander Ann McClain, as well as pilot Nichole Ayers, you see positioned as the camera in between them shows them in their launch and entry suits. We did hear before that they are allowed to bring up their visors through these set of procedures. Those suits are donned prior to joint operations, and they'll close their visors as part of the next dynamic phase, which will be the docking, which just as an added safety measure. Endurance less than 300 meters from the International Space Station, being illuminated by an orbital sunset right now. The views you see of Earth and of Dragon will start to get a little darker as we enter into an orbital sunset and orbital nighttime. Dragon, now brightened by the sun, will start to dim, and you'll start to see the docking lights as well as the navigation lights. Docking light will be white at the center of the spacecraft, and you'll see green and red lights on the forward bulkhead, green indicating the starboard position, red indicating the port position. The International Space Station cameras sometimes view from an upside down position, as you can see from this view, as the Earth is on the top left of your screen. So the port and starboard navigation light positions will be reversed, but it's because the camera is sort of upside down from the position of Earth. Additionally, the cameras on board the International Space Station are subject to the radiation of the station. Now, the station itself does receive a certain amount of radiation, but also a certain amount of protection from the Earth's atmosphere. As we are in low Earth orbit, 250 miles from the Earth is not terribly far. There's still a decent amount of protection, but there is a higher radiation environment. When we enter into an orbital nighttime, some of the cameras, you'll start to see some different colors on the camera as we enter into an orbital nighttime. Those pixels and different colors become a little bit more apparent. Those are from the radiation environment, the radiation damaging the pixels inside the cameras themselves. Insights from waypoint 1 arrival. We do have a go to proceed past waypoint 1. So Dragon, what you'll see is not a pause at waypoint 1, but it should proceed towards the keep out sphere. You'll notice some of the views change throughout our coverage here. Feeds coming from Dragon, you can see illuminating the International Space Station. Those feeds provided by ground
SpaceX
stations.
Approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue its approach.
Dragon, copy all.
That relayed from the SpaceX core in Hawthorne, California, confirmed by the crew aboard Endurance. We are proceeding inside the keep out sphere. You are seeing the docking light begin to blink at the center of Dragon Endurance. Features of Dragon becoming a little bit more apparent. The nose cone fully open, exposing the docking ring and the forward bulk of the Dracos. You did hear that Dragon will extend the soft docking ring mechanism. This allows for a cushioned contact as Dragon makes its way toward the International Docking Adapter. Docking comes in several phases, which includes contact and a soft capture, which is initiated by the docking ring. That docking ring is retracted to pull Dragon in closer to the International Space Station, and then begin a sequence to hard dock Dragon, the International Space Station. There are 12 hooks that are driven to really latch Dragon to the International Space Station. They're deployed in 2 sets of 6. And those will be confirmed by the crew. Once all of the hooks are driven, there is also an umbilical that extends and connects to an interface on the International Space Station side to provide power and data transfer between the 2 vehicles. Dragon right now operating on battery power and solar power that rated from the trunk. Once Dragon Once Dragon attaches to the International Space Station, it'll be receiving power from the International Space Station through the duration of its stay aboard. We did hear confirmation that Dragon is passing waypoint 1. So we're now moving inside the docking axis and towards the keep out sphere. Now passing waypoint 1, Dragon Endurance heading towards the International Space Station. We're following along from here inside Mission Control Houston, working jointly with teams in Hawthorne, California, to take us through the next series of steps, including crossing the keep out sphere and heading towards waypoint 2. Let's send it back over to Anna and Chris in Hawthorne.
And thanks, Gary. Yeah, so we have passed waypoint 1, so waypoint 2 is what is up next, and that will put Dragon only about 20 meters.
Station Houston, on the big loop, monitor approach per step 3 of 1.102, Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. Let us know when your review is complete and you are ready for docking.
You heard that.
Station copies on the big loop step 3, and I can confirm that review is complete and we're ready for docking.
So that call there between the ISS control room and the crew on board the International Space Station.
Houston copies. At waypoint 2, Dragon will hold for approximately 5 minutes.
And you heard that call there indicating that the ISS
Thanks for the heads up.
and the crew there are now ready for Dragon's docking to the forward docking adapter of the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Dragon approaching waypoint 2, which is the point about 20 meters from the International Space Station's forward docking adapter. And as we did there, we are expecting Dragon to hold for about once it reaches that point. It crossed through waypoint 1 and waypoint 0 without having to hold, but again, these waypoints or checkpoints are places we can hold if we need to, and if we don't, we can proceed forward through them.
And so we have gone through 2 of those waypoints, so waypoint 0 and 1, and so now Dragon is less than 200 meters away from the International Space Station, about 170 meters currently, away target of that forward docking port. And there you're seeing a great view on your screen of the Dragon Endurance spacecraft as it makes its final approach to the International Space Station. The teams in Mission Control Houston the teams at the International Space, or not the International Space Station, the SpaceX Mission Control teams behind us are, of course, doing some final go, no-go polls for docking. It's one of the final checkpoints between those teams to make sure everyone is good to proceed and to dock. We did hear that there will likely be a brief hold at waypoint 2. And again, that waypoint 2 is just 20 meters away from the International Space Station, so very close at that point. So they will hold briefly, and then from there, we will have our final approach and docking. We will have an initial soft capture. We did hear that the soft capture ring was being extended a few minutes ago. And then from there, they will begin to deploy those hooks, 2 sets of 6 for a total of 12 hooks to get that hard capture. And during that final hold, that again, we're expecting around the waypoint 2 mark, which is 20 meters away from the space station. During that final hold, they can possibly wait for better lighting conditions. So the space station does have exterior lights and Dragon can dock in the dark. But of course, we go through an orbit every 90 minutes. So there's a sunrise and sunset every 45 minutes. So if they need to wait for a little bit of improvement in the lighting, can use that waypoint 2 hold opportunity to wait for things like that, ensure final alignment, ensure everyone is good to go for that final approach and docking.
And as we could see right there, right before we switch to the inside view there, that's a great view on the outside. You can see that we're passing into an orbital sunset here, so approaching orbital night. And you can see how that lighting is very different on board the International Space Station. But what I love about that view too is you can see the forward navigation strobe light from Dragon eluding the forward element of the International Space Station where it will be docking just a few minutes from now, but of course approaching waypoint 20. This a view now from the International Space Station looking at Dragon. You can see the white navigation light indicating the center of the docking alignment axis there. And the green light that you see is the starboard navigation light. So just helping the folks on the International Space Station keep track of Dragon's orientation there. And the red one that just came into view is for the port side orientation. And I really love this too as we get into orbital night as we're approaching the space station, because we're probably going to see Dragon's Draco thrusters pulsing, and that's always a sight to behold in orbital night.
And so Dragon and the International Space Station.
Soft capture ring extension complete.
And we just heard confirmation that that soft capture ring extension has been fully completed. So that extension of the soft capture ring gets fully out and ready for that soft capture, that initial contact with the International Space Station. So right now, the International Space Station and Dragon are currently flying over Canada. And they're continuing to make its final approach to the International Space Station, currently just over 100 meters away as it makes its way to that waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away. So a little over 80 meters to go to the international, or to that waypoint 2, and then that final initial capture, and then we'll have the hooks deploy and have that hard capture milestone.
Now, as you're looking there at the SpaceX Mission Control here in Hawthorne, California, where we are, Dragon up on orbit as it is approaching waypoint 2 on that docking axis for the forward docking adapter. It's approaching the space station very, very slowly, about a few tenths of a meter per second. And it's also trying to keep in proper at that docking port. But again, waypoint 2 is where we're going to stop based on the calls, and we can do some final alignments there and final checkouts. But so far so good for Dragon. About 28 hours after liftoff now, after lifting off from the Kennedy Space Center yesterday afternoon at 7:03 p.m., completing the docking in just a few minutes from now.
And so Dragon is now less than 100 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues to make that final approach. And so right now we're seeing those live views of the SpaceX Mission Control team here in Hawthorne, California. And typically we'll go back to these views when we do have those brief loss of signal between the International Space Station and Dragon and the ground, and we'll regain those views shortly. It's just a handover between satellites. So that tracking and data relay satellite system that the International Space Station relies on, they have a brief handover period between satellites, which causes a loss of those views periodically throughout our coverage.
Kind of like going from cell phone tower to cell phone tower.
And so let's see, Dragon is less than 80 meters away, so continuing to approach waypoint 2, about 60 meters to go until it reaches waypoint 2. Again, Dragon to hold at waypoint 2 for just a few minutes to ensure final alignment, to ensure lighting conditions are good before we have that final docking. We are expecting that docking to take place around 9 a.m. Pacific, a little bit later than that. And right before that final docking takes place, we will hear that call for CHOP that we mentioned previously, which is the crew hands-off point. So right before right after you hear that call is typically when that soft capture takes place.
And that CHOP call that we've been talking about, and basically what that means is the crew can no longer manually abort Dragon away from the International Space Station if there should be a reason to do so. It would all be based on Dragon's automation at that point. Everything going very well for Dragon as it continues to approach the space station. The crew monitoring the automated approach for the vehicle, as well as any escape options they might have to do, but again, not expecting to have to use those.
Station Houston, on the big loop, the no exercise constraint for docking begins now.
Station copies.
And so you did just hear a call up from the Capcom, or capsule communicator at Mission Control in Houston, to the crew on the International Space Station, mentioning that the exercise constraint has started. So typically when we have visiting vehicles such as Dragon arriving and departing the International Space Station, there are constraints on crew exercise, and that's basically to prevent additional loads from being imparted on the station during these dynamic operations.
And I love this sort of night vision-esque view here from Dragon. looking at the International Space Station. So this is a view from the Dragon Endurance carrying the Crew-10 crew. The forward docking port there is in the center of your screen, sort of being illuminated every few seconds by that light from Dragon. And what I love about this is you can see the Crew-9 Dragon directly above that docking port. And of course, Crew-9 going to be coming home after a brief handover period with the Crew-10 crew. And then inside of Dragon Endurance here, you have Commander Anne McClain on the left-hand side of your screen, pilot Nichole Ayers on the right. Next to Nichole is Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov, and on Anne's left is JAXA, or Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi. Anne and Takuya are returning to the International Space Station for their second long-duration missions, and Nichole and Kirill are on their first missions to space.
So it's getting pretty real for the 4 crew members that make up Crew-10. Right now, they are just under 25 meters away from the International Space Station, so just outside of that waypoint 2, which is that point at which Dragon will hold for a few minutes.
Big loop. You see you're approaching waypoint 2. Crew visors are closed.
Copy. Crew-10 visors are closed.
We did just hear that confirmation that the crew is approaching waypoint 2, so they see that on those screens in front of them. They see the distance, and they're able to monitor that approach as well.
And this is great because you can see Dragon's Draco thrusters firing here. You've got the red and the green navigation lights as well as the white one, but all those little flashes and pulses that you're seeing around the vehicle are the thrusters, keeping that alignment as we continue to approach waypoint 2, 20 meters from the ISS, where again, we are expecting to hold for a few minutes up. And you can see we're really getting close, considering now we're really illuminating that forward docking port with Dragon.
And so Dragon is actually at that waypoint 2 mark now, just around 20 meters away, so we will have that hold briefly. And recently, the team in Mission Control Houston did conduct their final go-no-go poll as well for docking.
SpaceX on the big loop. Dragon is holding at waypoint 2 for Dragon eye assessment.
You hear that confirmation.
Dragon, copy.
And you hear that confirmation that Dragon is holding. Now you're on the left-hand side of your screen as you're looking from the ISS's camera out at Dragon. Even though we've said Dragon is holding, you're still going to see some of those thruster pulses, because holding in space is not like just stopping your car that holds the same position.
And Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Ground is bold to go, and we'll be enabling approach shortly. Confirm crew readiness for final approach.
SpaceX Dragon, Crew-10 is ready for final approach.
And that is great words there to hear from SpaceX Mission Control.
Resume has been commanded. Reminder, once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Copy.
And Anna, here we go.
So we did just hear that they have the go to resume final approach, so that we had that brief hold completed at waypoint 2, which was just 20 meters away from the International Space Station. So Dragon will now resume its final approach and finish its fly into the International Space Station's Node 2 forward docking port.
And we heard
Dragon is in approach 2.
Your good confirmation of Dragon in that approach 2 mode, meaning it has passed waypoint 2 and is coming into the station. Again, you can see
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 in 1.102 Dragon approach and retreat monitoring.
Station copy.
And that was the call from the International Space Station Flight Control Room to the crew on the ISS. Again, just everyone confirming, making sure everyone's on the same page, as Dragon is now very close to docking with the International Space Station here today.
And so Dragon is now just 17 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing to close in on its target. Coming up here shortly, we will likely hear that call out for CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands Off Point. That typically takes place less than 30 seconds before docking. So as soon as you hear that, you know that that docking will take place very soon after. And then at that point, when we hear the CHOP call out, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon. And so also on the International Space Station, we have NASA astronaut Nick Hague monitoring this final approach. And then once Dragon is docked, NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore will walk through the hatch preparation and opening steps to welcome the crew on board. And Dragon is now less than 14 meters away from the International Space Station and continuing that final approach.
These very delicate series of maneuvers now, Dragon approaching very, very slowly relative to the International Space Station. Again, we talked earlier that launch is all about accelerating the vehicles to orbital velocity, and even though both Dragon and the ISS are traveling at about 17,500 miles per hour or 27,500 kilometers per hour, they are moving very, very slow, like 1/10 of a meter per second in relation to each other right now.
Dragon now at about 10 meters away from the International Space Station. We're standing by for that call out for CHOP here shortly.
SpaceX Dragon, 10 meters.
Copy, 10.
And again, you're looking at the forward docking port of the International Space Station, which is mounted to the Harmony or Node 2 module of the space station. The Crew-9 Dragon, which has been there since September, is also attached to a docking port on this module, and that Dragon is actually just off the top of your screen there as Crew-10's Dragon comes in for docking in just a few moments. And I love these views again. You've got the Dragon, you've got the ISS staring at Dragon on the left-hand side of your screen, and you've got Dragon looking at its docking port on the ISS on the right.
And Dragon is now less than 7 meters away from the International Space Station as it continues to make that final approach. Traveling with a range rate of less than 0.082, which, as you mentioned earlier, it continues to get slower and slower as we make this final approach.
5 meters.
Copy, 5 meters.
So the next call we should hear is CHOP, or that crew hands-off period, followed moments later by docking.
That typically comes at about 2 meters away from the International Space Station. Right now, we're less than 4 meters away. Less than 3 meters away.
2 meters, please hands off.
Copy, hands off.
There is the CHOP call.
Standing by for initial contact of Dragon to the International Space Station.
Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
And there you heard Dragon has successfully docked to the International Space Station. We have contact and soft capture confirmed. Soft capture meaning that the initial soft capture ring around Dragon has physically connected with the international docking adapter. And this is just the first part of the overall docking sequence, Anna.
And so we did have that contact confirmed at 9:04 p.m. Pacific, 11:04 p.m. Central, while both Dragon and the International Space Station were flying 260 statute miles.
Capture ring retraction in progress.
Flying 260 statute miles over the Atlantic Ocean, and we did just hear confirmation that that soft capture ring is now beginning to retract. So they're beginning those steps to firmly attach Dragon to the International Space Station.
can't wait to see it and everything that they're going to be able to do up there.
So they will be contributing to about 200 different experiments and technology demonstrations from human research. They're doing some flammability studies.
Retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
And we did just hear confirmation that the soft capturing has been fully retracted. So again, that soft capture that happened with the initial contact about 4 minutes ago at 9:04 p.m. Pacific, 11:04 p.m. Central. Station and Dragon were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. They are going to hold that docking's hard capture sequence a little bit to make some final configurations. We do expect that full hard capture process to take about 15 minutes, so we have about 10 or so more minutes to go there. The next step in that process will be to begin to deploy those hooks. Again, there are 12 total hooks that have to fully engage and really bring Dragon in for a nice hard seal to the International Space Station's forward docking port.
And sort of like a lot of things with spaceflight, docking is not just a singular instantaneous event when the two vehicles actually meet and connect with one another. There's the soft capture, which we're through with Dragon right now. There's also, like the vehicles are moving in relation to one another at docking, so they've also got to make sure that any motion between them is dampened out and that they're all really ready for that hard capture connection.
And there you're seeing a live view on your screen on the right-hand side. That's a view from the International Space Station of the Dragon spacecraft Endurance, now docked to the International Space Station's Node 2 forward docking port. And again, that docking took place at 9:04 p.m. following an approximately 28-hour journey.
Station Houston, on the Big Loop, MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And there we hear good confirmation that what we were waiting for there and holding the docking sequence has been, we've gotten through that, and now we are going to begin that hard capture sequence, and that's what you were talking about, Anna, driving the series of 12 hooks, 6 at a time, to form that hard capture. And again, we expect that process to take about 15 minutes. But it really is great to see the Dragon Endurance back on the space station. Its 4th trip to space. This particular capsule has launched the Crew-3, Crew-5, and Crew-7 missions, and of course returned those astronauts safely to Earth. And now it's doing it again for the 4th time for the Crew-10.
And it's the 10th total rotational mission for SpaceX flying crew to the International Space Station. Again, we did hear confirmation that the first set of 6 hooks for a total of 12 is now driving. So those will make a hard capture, and then they will drive the second set of 6 hooks. Off yesterday of 7:03 p.m. Eastern, 4:03 p.m. Pacific from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, Launch Complex 39A. They had approximately 9-minute ride to orbit before we had that orbital insertion and second engine cutoff, and then they've been traveling in free flight since then. They had a series of burns that set them up for a docking today at 9:00 p.m. Pacific. They first had their phase burn, and that was completed yesterday at 4:52 p.m. Pacific, followed by a boost burn at 12:08 p.m. Pacific, a close burn a little bit after that at 12:50 p.m. And then they had a mid-course out-of-plane burn, a transfer burn, co-elliptic burn, and just recently we had that approach initiation burn. So a lot of burns to set them up and get them on a track to where they are now at the International Space Station. And
after that sequence of burns, it went pretty good after that point. We saw Dragon cruise through the waypoint 1 and waypoint 0 targets of 400 and 220 meters respectively from the International Space Station, and then close into that waypoint 2 were a brief hold and then right on in for a picture perfect docking over the North Atlantic. And so we did have that soft capture at 9:04. Now the first set of 6, once that final set of hooks finishes closing
and driving, we will have that hard capture complete. And then from there, they will, of course, begin the pressurization process of the vestibule.
And of course, part of Crew 10's arrival at the space station means that it's time for another crew who's been up there for a few months to come on home. So a few days after Crew 10, now that Crew 10 has docked, in a few days we will have the planned undocking and return of Crew 9, which includes NASA astronauts Nichole, Butch Wilmore, and Sunita Williams, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Gorbanov. Two of them have been up there since September.
Typical, we like to ensure a continuous presence of U.S. crew, and then the Crew-9 will help bring Crew 10 up to vestibule will begin. And again, NASA astronaut Butch Wilmore on the International Space Station side is on tap to be to help with those hatch opening operations today. Again, we are expecting hatch opening about an hour and a half or so after or from now, and then from there will be a welcoming combined with the farewell remarks of Crew 10, since that handover is pretty short. And then from there they will adjust to station life. There will be a safety briefing, and then they'll get right into it as Expedition 72 members for the next month before they become Expedition 73.
And and you can see that's Sunny
International Space Station crew. Again, they are going to get that pressurization process underway here shortly, and they will pressurize that area known as the vestibule, which is the area between the Dragon hatch and the station hatch that was previously exposed to the vacuum of space. And then once that happens, they will conduct a series of leak checks. And there on your screen, you just saw NASA astronaut Sunny Williams actually floating right in front of that hatch that will be open in just a little bit.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop. Docking sequence complete. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connections shortly. You are go to doff suits per procedure 4.012. Crew 10, welcome aboard the International Space Station.
SpaceX Houston and ISS, this is Dragon mission specialist Takuya Onishi on the big loop. We copy the docking sequence is complete. We are go for 4.012 for docking suits. And on behalf of the entire crew, I would like to thank all the partners, especially our SpaceX friends who trained us and enabled us to safely arrive at the International Space Station. It was so amazing to see the ISS shining in the darkness of space and symbolizing human beings, technology, and international cooperation. And it's such a great honor for us to be part of this program. We have a lot of exciting work ahead of us that we are looking forward to. Again, thank you very much to everybody who helps us to get here.
And there you just heard some really nice words between Crew-10 as they have now arrived at the International Space Station. We do have that confirmation of hard capture complete. Again, those words were coming from JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi, who is serving as one of the mission specialists for Crew-10. And so now with Dragon successfully and safely docked.
And Houston copies all. Welcome to the International Space Station, Crew-10. We look forward to your work and the spirit of cooperation with which you've arrived.
Thank you very much, Dennis.
And there's some words from the capsule communicator, Capcom, in Houston, in the International Space Station Flight Control Room. Back to Crew-10, and again, now with Dragon docked, that's going to wrap us up for our coverage here in Hawthorne, but our coverage for Crew-10 won't stop there.
That's correct. It's great to see the Dragon Endurance docked back at the station and see Crew-10 ready to begin their multi-month mission in there. In a minute, we're going to toss it back to Gary in Mission Control Houston to take us through the vestibule depressurization hatch opening, and then we'll see NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nichole Ayers, along with JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov float into the International Space Station. But first, let's do a quick recap of how we got here. The crew suited up yesterday before their launch and then had their ride to the pads in those sleek-looking Teslas before ingressing an even sleeker-looking Dragon. They lifted off right on time from the Kennedy Space Center at pad 39A at 7:03 p.m. Eastern Time on Friday, March 14th. Stage 1 successfully returned to a landing at Landing Zone 1 for recovery and reuse a few minutes later. Dragon separated from the second stage of Falcon 9, and once it was safely in orbit, deployed its nose cone to reveal that docking adapter and all the navigation aids needed to get to the International Space Station. Dragon also completed 5 major burns on its journey to the International Space Station, coming in for a docking at 9:04 p.m. Pacific Time, 11:04 p.m. Central Time today, March 15th, 2025, and it was Dragon's 10th crew rotation mission for NASA and the Commercial Crew Program.
That's right, and now that Crew-10 has arrived to the International Space Station, we are looking ahead to the return of Crew-9, and we will be taking you along as they return home after their long-duration stay on board the International Space Station. Teams will be assessing return dates, which will then be announced on nasa.gov, so be sure to tune in as NASA and SpaceX will then bring you live coverage every step of their return home. And you can also follow SpaceX and NASA on social media for real-time updates. But thank you again for watching our coverage of docking, and go NASA, go SpaceX, and go to Crew-10 and Crew-9. For those of you watching on X, please head over to NASA Plus to follow the coverage of hatch opening and welcoming live.
So thanks everyone for joining us here in Hawthorne. Thank you specifically to Anna for joining us from Johnson Space Center, and
And thank you everyone again for tuning in. We'll now go ahead and pass it over to NASA's Gary Jordan at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, who will continue sharing the mission of hatch opening and welcoming as the crew prepares to board their home for the next few months, the International Space Station. Thank you so much.
And talk SpaceX on the big loop. We've got you loud and clear for the cabin mic comm check.
Okay, we have you loud and clear.
This is Mission Control Houston. You're looking at a live view of the International Space Station Flight Control Room. Thanks to Anna and Chris over in SpaceX Mission Control in Hawthorne, California. We just wrapped up our joint coverage of Crew-10's arrival to the International Space Station, docking at 11:04 p.m. Central Time, 9:04 p.m. Pacific. The International Space Station and Dragon were flying 260 statute miles over the Atlantic Ocean at the time of docking. Now that the docking sequence is complete, which means the ring is fully retracted, hooks are driven, and the umbilical is extended, draw power from the International Space Station and data, crew inside Dragon is getting prepared for the next set of procedures to configure Dragon in such a way for its extended stay aboard the International Space Station, while the crew aboard the International Space Station prepares for opening up the hatches on the other side. Now, the hatch opening sequence is quite extensive. We're expecting the Dragon hatch to be opened a little less than an hour and a half from now. The projected time is 12:45 a.m. Central Time on March 16th. However, this is a variable time. It is the expected time that the Dragon hatch will open. Shortly after, we are planning a welcome ceremony as well as a farewell ceremony, given a shorter duration handover period for the crew aboard the International Space Station before Crew-9 undocks. We will say hello to the Crew-10 astronauts and cosmonaut aboard the International Space Station, welcomed by Expedition 72, while Crew-9 says farewell ahead of their next few days of getting their SpaceX Dragon spacecraft configured for undock and return to splash down off the coast. Right now you're looking at Dragon Endurance docked to the forward port of the International Space Station. Crew-9 Dragon docked to the Zenith port. Between the International Space Station and Dragon, providing telemetry and allowing Hague to monitor Dragon's safe approach, docking again at 11:04 p.m. Central Time. Now that Dragon is docked and the crew is getting ready to open the hatch on the International Space Station side, it's Butch Wilmore who is tasked with the responsibility